The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty auction yard, bathing everything in gold and grit. The place stank of hay, sweat, and the low hum of judgment. It was the kind of small-town gathering where everyone knew everyone, and no one forgot anything, especially not mistakes. Wade Carter stood near the edge of the auction pen, one boot propped on the lowest rail, arms crossed, face unreadable beneath the brim of his weathered hat. His hands, rough as rawhide, hung like they had known too much work and too little rest. He wasn't there for livestock, not today. Today, the bidding was for something else entirely. A lineup of teenagers deemed too difficult for foster homes, shuffled from place to place like unwanted stock. Wade hadn't planned on coming, but something had pulled him there, a quiet tug in his chest he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the silence back home on his ranch, too loud after all these years. Maybe it was the memory of a daughter he couldn't save. Or maybe it was that familiar ache that came from watching someone stand alone. Then he saw her. She stood like she dared anyone to try her. Hair unkempt, boots worn down to the soles, arms crossed like a wall too high to climb. Her eyes, dark and defiant, burned beneath a tangle of bangs. The tag tied around her wrist read like a warning. Remy. Too wild, unfit for home placement. The auctioneer tried to start the bidding. No one moved. There were murmurs, sideways, glances. One woman shook her head. A man 2 rows down let out a snort and turned away. She tore up 3 placements, someone whispered. Bites like a cornered dog. Wade didn't flinch. He just watched her. She met his gaze for a split second, steady, fearless. But he saw it. Beneath the anger, beneath the armor, there was fear. Not of him, not of the crowd. Of hope. He felt something twist in his gut. She reminded him of a filly he once took in, wild-eyed and half-starved, kicking at anything that got close. That filly turned out to be the finest cutting horse he ever broke, not by force but by trust. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Well then, any takers? Silence, a few chuckles, a sarcastic, "Y'all scared?" Then Wade raised his hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, just a slow lift of one worn arm like he was reaching for something only he could see. The crowd turned. Some laughed outright. "Carter's finally lost it," someone said under their breath. "She ain't for riding, Carter," one man called out, grinning like it was funny. Wade's voice came low, steady. "I didn't buy her to ride." The auctioneer blinked. "Sold," he said quickly, as if afraid Wade might change his mind. Remy didn't say a word as she stepped off the platform. She didn't thank him. She didn't ask where they were going. She just followed him in silence, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. As they walked past the sneering faces and sideways glances, Wade didn't say much either. What could he say? Words weren't what built trust. Actions were, and he'd just made his. He didn't know her story, and she didn't know his. But he knew one thing. Some souls weren't wild. They were just waiting for the right place to run free. And maybe, just maybe, they could find that place together. The ranch house stood crooked and quiet on the edge of a brittle plain, where wind swept dust across the porch like it was trying to erase the place from memory. The paint peeled from the siding, the screen door creaked with every breeze, and the boards groaned like they carried more than just age. It wasn't the kind of house that welcomed visitors, and maybe that's why Wade Carter lived there alone. Until now. Remy had been on the ranch for 3 weeks. Long, slow weeks where little was said but much was felt. She didn't talk much, not even when spoken to. She didn't make trouble, but she moved like someone who expected it. Every noise made her tense. Every kindness made her suspicious. She worked hard, though. Always up before sunrise, boots on, hands blistered but never idle. She mucked stalls, hauled hay, fixed fence lines with quiet determination. But it was clear she wasn't doing it for praise. She was doing it to keep her mind from unraveling. Wade gave her space. He was a man of few words himself, not because he didn't have things to say, but because life had taught him words didn't always help. He saw the fire in her, the mistrust, the need to prove herself or disappear. It wasn't unfamiliar. He'd seen that look before, years ago, in the mirror, and he'd seen it in his daughter's eyes before the world took her away. Evenings were the hardest. After the work was done and the sun sank low, the silence between them grew thick. Remy ate her dinner with her head down. Wade across the table chewed slowly, sometimes glancing up but never pushing conversation. They were two strangers under the same roof, both carrying ghosts they didn't speak of. One night, while Wade was out in the barn checking on a sick calf, Remy wandered through the house. Curiosity, maybe, or just restlessness. She passed by the old upright piano no one had touched in years, the mantel where dust coated forgotten picture frames. Something made her stop. On a shelf near the hallway, tucked behind a stack of worn books, was a photograph, faded, black and white, slightly curled at the edges. A girl, maybe 13, stood smiling with a horse beside her, the same barn in the background. Her hair was long, braided. Her smile was wide, eyes bright with life. Remy stared at the picture for a long time. Something about it made her chest ache. She picked it up, turned it in her hand like it might answer something. Wade came in quietly, boots thudding soft against the floor. He stopped when he saw her holding it. She run too? Remy asked, not looking at him. Wade stood still for a moment before answering. No, he said, voice thick. She never got the chance. Remy nodded once and set the picture back exactly where it had been. Later that night, long after the house had gone still, Remy sat, alone in the barn. The colt nickered softly in its stall. She sat in the hay, arms wrapped around her knees, and let the tears fall without fighting them. Not loud, not wild, just quiet, steady grief. The kind you only let out when no one's around to see. She didn't cry for herself, not exactly. She cried for the girl in the photo, for the man who still looked for her in the silence, and maybe, for the first time, a little for the version of herself that might still be worth saving. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, casting a soft orange light over the dry pasture when the colt made its break. It was a young thing, barely halter-trained with too much muscle and not enough trust. One moment it was in the pen, the next it had kicked through a loose latch and bolted, tail high, hooves tearing into the earth like it had every intention of outrunning the world. Wade was already halfway through his coffee when he heard the commotion. Shouts, the thud of boots, the clatter of hooves against fencing. The ranch hands were scrambling, trying to corner the colt, but it was having none of it. Every time they got close, it reared or spun or shot off in the opposite direction, nostrils flaring, eyes wide with panic. Stubborn little beast. One hand growled, throwing down a lead rope. Not worth the risk, another added. That one's just too wild. Wade stepped onto the porch, mug in hand, watching the scene unfold. He didn't say much. He rarely did. Just stood there, watching the colt pant and circle the paddock like a ghost chased it. It wasn't just fear in the animal's eyes. It was fury, frustration, confusion, like it didn't know who to hate for what it had been through. Then, without a word, Remy stepped forward. No one called her over. No one expected her to move. But she did. Quiet as sunrise, slipping through the fence like it wasn't even there. The ranch hands stopped talking, turning toward her with a mixture of confusion and warning on their faces. "Kid, don't," one of them started, but Wade raised a hand, silencing him. Remy moved slowly, carefully, boots pressing into the earth with a rhythm that matched the colt's frantic breathing. Her eyes didn't flash. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't bring a rope. She just stood in the center of the ring, hands by her sides as the colt tossed. Its head and pawed the ground. The animal backed away, snorted, threatened, but she didn't flinch. Not once. Wade's fingers tightened around his mug. The minutes stretched. The colt paced a wide circle around her, but her stillness began to change something in the air. The colt's step slowed. Its head lowered, just a fraction. Remy stepped forward, a half step at a time, not breaking eye contact. No words, no tricks. Just trust offered quietly, like a hand extended in darkness. Then, to everyone's amazement, the colt took a step toward her, and another. It stopped just short of her reach, eyes still wide. She lifted her hand slowly, gently, letting the colt decide. And after a long pause, it leaned in, just enough to breathe her in. Wade let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. From the porch, he saw something no one else did. Not just a girl and a wild animal, but a mirror. Two creatures misunderstood, labeled unworthy, left to fend for themselves. Somehow they saw each other in a way no one else could. He whispered to himself, the words sticking in his throat. She wasn't too wild. His voice cracked, just a little. She just needed someone to believe. Back in the ring, the colt nudged Remy's hand with its nose. She didn't smile, but something softened in her face. Not triumph. Recognition. She turned slightly, leading it forward. And it followed her. Not broken, just willing. That was the day the ranch stopped being a place she worked. It started becoming home. The storm rolled in fast, black clouds stretching low and heavy across the sky like they meant to swallow the land whole. Lightning cracked in the distance, jagged and white, and the air grew thick with tension. One of those storms that makes animals restless and men uneasy. Wade stood on the porch, eyes narrowed at the horizon, the wind lifting dust around his boots. He knew this kind of storm didn't just bring rain. It brought fire. It struck just after dusk. A bolt lit the sky with a sound like the earth splitting open, and within minutes the ridge behind the barn glowed with orange flickers. Flames caught dry grass like matchsticks, leaping from one patch to another, fast and hungry. The horses screamed in their stalls. The smell of smoke poured in like a wave. "Fire!" someone shouted from the bunkhouse. Wade was already moving, grabbing buckets, shouting orders to the ranch hands. The wind was against them, gusting wild and hot. There wasn't time to think, only move. But it was Remy who reached the barn first. By the time Wade rounded the hill, he saw her silhouetted against the growing blaze, sprinting through smoke. The ranch hands yelled for her to stop, but she didn't. She threw open the barn doors as the fire cracked overhead, embers raining like sparks from a forge. The horses inside were panicking, kicking at their stalls, eyes wide with terror. Wade's heart lodged in his throat. "Remy!" She didn't answer. One by one, she undid the latches, slapping the horses to get them out. Some bolted into the night. Some hesitated. She screamed and pushed, guiding them through the haze, and then the last colt, the same wild one she'd gentled weeks before, stood frozen in its stall, trembling, too scared to move. The flames had crept close now, licking the walls. Wade and two hands were rushing forward with wet blankets, but Remy was already inside, coughing, waving her arms, coaxing the colt forward. "Come on," she rasped, voice nearly gone. The colt refused. She didn't stop. She reached out, touched its side, pressed her forehead to its mane, and finally, miraculously, it stepped forward, stumbling beside her into the smoke. They emerged just as the roof of the barn groaned behind them. Her jeans were singed, her face streaked black with soot, her eyes bloodshot. She led the colt out into the field, then collapsed to her knees, coughing violently. Wade reached her, dropped beside her, arms shaking, not from the heat but from fear. He looked at her, this girl who had come into his life with fists up and walls thick enough to keep the world out. Now here she was, half-choked, scraped raw, leading others to safety. "You could have run," he said, his voice hoarse, eyes shining in the flickering light. Remy looked up at him, breath shallow, a ghost of a smile on her ash-streaked face. "I did," she said. "But this time I came back." And there it was. Not just courage, not just survival. but choice. Shiwei didn't stay because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because she'd found something worth coming back for. The fire was finally beaten back that night. But something else had changed too. Something deeper than any flame could touch. The ranch wasn't just where Remy lived now, it was where she belonged. The first hint of dawn stretched pale pink across the hills, casting a gentle light over the sleeping land. The morning was quiet. No wind, no distant thunder, just the soft rhythm of hooves pressing into the dew-covered earth. Wade rode tall in the saddle, shoulders relaxed, hat pulled low. Beside him, not behind, rode Remy. She sat easy in the saddle now, not stiff or wary, but balanced like she belonged there. The colt, now full of strength and calm energy, moved beneath her with smooth confidence. Where once it had bucked and bolted, it now responded to the slightest touch of her reins. They were a team, fluid, connected, as if they'd always known each other. It wasn't training that had made it so. It was trust. Wade glanced over at her as they crested a ridge, the golden light beginning to spill across the valley below. She wore an old denim shirt, sleeves rolled, a bandana around her neck, her hair braided back against the breeze. Her face had changed. Still fierce, still sharp, but softer somehow. More open. There was laughter there now, tucked in the corners of her eyes, though she'd never admit it out loud. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them had grown into something different, a shared rhythm, like the beat of hooves on dry ground or the wind through fence wire. When they needed words, they used them. When they didn't, they let the land speak for them. That morning, as they checked the herd and rode the perimeter of the fence, there was no ceremony, no moment marked by fanfare. Just two riders, side by side, moving through a world that had once tried to forget them both. The colt tossed its head playfully and Remy gave it a gentle pat. Wade chuckled under his breath. At one point she leaned back in the saddle and looked across the fields. "Fence looks good," she said. Wade nodded. "That's because someone around here knows how to mend it proper." She smiled, just a flicker, and nudged her horse forward, leading the way toward the next hill. Wade followed, and for the first time, he realized something he hadn't dared believe when she first arrived. She wasn't a girl needing saving anymore. She was a partner. The ranch had begun to change, subtly but deeply. Not in its bones. It was still cracked and dusty, still a place where sweat and stubbornness held everything together, but in its heart. Remy had painted the old barn door. She played the piano some nights, hesitantly at first, then with surprising skill. And Wade, for the first time in years, had started keeping coffee hot for two. As they rode on, the sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the land in gold. The dust behind their horses kicked up and hung in the morning light like mist. It was quiet still, but it was the kind of quiet that came not from absence but from peace. A voice might have spoken then, not aloud, but in the kind of way that speaks to a heart ready to listen. She wasn't born too wild for any man. She was born to ride beside one who'd never try to break her spirit, and so they rode, two survivors of different storms, bound not by blood, but by the choice to stay, to fight, to heal. In the vastness of that broken land, something whole had begun to grow, something good, and together they kept riding forward.